So a lot of talk about the Crusades lately. A lot of it was started by James White, but in all fairness to James White is responding to the fact that, for quite a while now, evangelicals and particularly of the Reformed persuasion have been nonetheless, celebrating and lauding the Crusades as an effort to, fight Islam. And I think they've actually undersold the usefulness of the Crusades, because I don't think most people, and it doesn't sound like James White was aware that there were more than 4 Crusades, given his Twitter comments. But there were also Crusades, and they're called the Livonian Crusades, that fought in the northern Europe. So a lot of different crusades that happened, not just in the Holy Land, and not just 4 either. So we're gonna have a bit of an expert opinion weigh in on the situation now. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing all right. I'm happy to be talking about history. It's my favorite topic. So, and the Crusades is something I've been studying for a long time. So, yeah, I'm happy to help you and your viewers out.
So I'm also, something of a history buff myself. So yeah, I got some questions. I'll be, hopefully not too in the weeds, but it's just whatever what I watch usually on my spare time on YouTube is, a lot of more either history or just pop culture, sports escapism. There's not as much in between. I do watch, people like John Harris and stuff like that, but for the most part, I'm trying to escape, just learn more about history, ancient or medieval battles and stuff like that. So the Crusades, I've definitely watched a lot of content on YouTube regarding the Crusades and stuff like that. Uh, so first question, because get a little bit more about your background. You say that you're a traditional Catholic. I kind of want to get a gauge for what that means.
Okay, I've been Catholic my whole life. I do call myself a traditional Catholic. If you look at my account on X, but like I'm not the kind of guy who's going to separate from the church. Like I don't attend an SXPX chapel. I attend a Latin mass, but I attend the Latin mass that's under the local bishop. I don't reject Vatican II. So like I'm not like certainly not a sedevacantist. So I, I don't know if that helps. I don't know how familiar you are with the certain camps of the traditionalist movement. Being an
I mean, yeah, I know there's like Franciscans, Dominicans. I don't think Jesuits would count as traditional. And I don't know if Augustinians are still a thing.
well,
But
well, those are groups. You can have a
okay,
traditional, like a Franciscan who's a traditional, or a Dominican, but then you can have Franciscans and Dominicans who are both rank modernists too. So,
okay,
yeah.
all right. I don't know. I know we've had Eastern Orthodox on here, but I don't know how many Catholics I've had on the channel as guests before. So I just figured I'd ask. While we have the opportunity. So the Crusades. So I guess the first question I have is about the Council of Chalcedon. Specifically, does issue some sort of ruling, if you would call it that, against the idea of warrior priests. The idea that it doesn't really allow for bishops to take up arms, really for any reason. But it does seem like medieval church and medieval bishops did not necessarily agree with that. Now, and there's a very proud history within the church, even in Protestantism. Black Robe Regiment in the United States Revolution. There's a proud history of bishops taking up arms, and that does factor into the Crusades. I'm not. I believe there are examples prior to the Crusades, but definitely that is a thing in medieval history. So what are your thoughts on the Council of Chalcedon and their decision, and how that should factor into the Crusades, if it does, or if it doesn't.
Okay, I'd have to see that canon of Chalcedon, but in terms of clergy taking part in armed combat, that was when the Pope calls the First Crusade in 1095 in Clermont. There was no opposition to it. Like today, there's opposition from Catholics who look back and it's like, yeah, we shouldn't have done that. But back then, everyone did that. They all knew the Pope was doing that. But eventually, they established the Crusader states, and you have specific groups you had some bishops who fought in battles, like Bishop Adamar. He fought in battles, and then you eventually have the monastic orders like the Templars. There was opposition to that from some sources. There's a guy named Walter Mapp who was against it. I got some of his stuff over there. Who's a 12th century Englishman, and he's against the idea of like having like a kind of order that's like a monastic order, but you fight in it, specifically talking about the Templars. But there are examples of clergy being in battle in both East and West around the time of the schism. I got an account. I believe it's Atelietes, a Byzantine chronicler who chronicles priests fighting in battle, like a Greek Orthodox priest. I guess it's 1040s. This is right before the schism. So, I mean, it was not unheard of. I'd have to see that canon of Chalcedon. That's obviously way earlier in church history.
Right.
So yeah, but yeah, no, it's true that it was controversial to have clergy in battle.
All right. Now, I wanted to ask: would you consider the Reconquista, which arguably starts prior to the First Crusade? It starts in the late 700s, or early 800s. That often gets lumped in with the Crusades. Do you consider that, in part of the whole Crusades, or do you think that is completely itemized or separate?
Well, the first battle of the Reconquista was in about 718, the Battle of Covadonga. Like that was in the northern region of Spain, Asturias. The Muslim invasion is halted, so they didn't ever conquer the northern regions of Spain. That was about 718 or so, 720-ish, around there. And then slowly they start to reel it back. And then the Crusades, a friend of mine, she asked me, are there any famous Spanish Crusaders? I'm like, there's not a whole lot because they were kind of busy doing their own thing in Spain. In the 13th century, I think the year was 1212, there was a battle, like things in the Holy Land were kind of, stagnant. There was a period, there was no big battles going on. So I believe the Templars were there in the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, was Crusaders against the Almohad Caliphate, who was the caliphate in Spain at that time. And they were able to defeat the Muslims. And that kind of crippled their power base. And in 1236, they take back Cordoba. And 1248, they took back Seville. And then at that time, the Muslims were reduced to the very far south of Spain in Granada. So yeah, there was kind of some interplay going on when things were pretty quiet in the Holy Land. The Templars went over and helped out in Spain. So yes, there's certainly part of it.
Yeah, because some would say that the Reconquista was more of a retroactive idea in terms of pairing with Spanish nationalism, but at the same time, there was always there had to have always kind of been a religious motivation for why Al-Andalus was an enemy of a Christian kingdom at the same time. So
yeah, that was certainly the case. Now you talk about Spanish nationalism, like we they didn't have the same kind of nationalism back then, and they didn't have the same kind of identity as a Spanish. Like back then,
Right.
you had the Kingdom of Castile, the Kingdom of Aragon, the Kingdom of Navarre, and like that came together over time, specifically with Ferdinand and Isabella in the 15th century, and then you kind of get talks of Spain. So the terms kind of projected back onto them.
The term nationalism or the term Reconquista? I believe you're talking about
Nationalism,
nationalism. Okay.
nationalism, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty interesting time in European history where you have a lot of, states kind of, there's higher crown authority than there used to be. And, they're forming more of I don't want to say a national identity, but the idea that you're having a standardization of languages, uh, and legal structure. It's a pretty fascinating time, uh, you know.
Yeah, and in that days, like in those days, you had some saintly. Like if you're talking about the 1200s, you have some monarchs. King Ferdinand the Third of Castile. This is not the Ferdinand who got married to Queen Isabella. That's
Right.
Ferdinand of Aragon. But Ferdinand of Castile was actually a saint, a Catholic saint, and he's the one that conquered in 1236. He conquered Cordoba back from the Islamic Caliphate, and in the that time you had like a whole bunch of like saint kings who were like like in England you had Edward the Confessor. He's a bit earlier. King Louis the Ninth of France, Saint Louis, the city in Missouri where
Right.
is named after him. Um, a- and Vladimir of Kiev. I guess he's the late 900s, but he's from that line of medieval kings. And like it's a big difference at that time the contrast between king, like a saint king, and like to be a king at that point was like kind of like an occupational hazard for excommunication. There's a lot of kings that got excommunicated back then because of the way the church was in Europe, because we had the investiture controversy. Like for example, like you go over to the Byzantine Empire, if the king did something bad and the patriarch is trying to teach him a lesson, he just removes him, puts his friend as patriarch. That's that happened a few times, right? The church was controlled by the state. In the West, the two were more separate. And so that's interesting because that kind of allowed the Crusades to happen. Offering the plenary indulgence for a knight and their vassals, and that was the First Crusade. Eventually, in the Second and Third Crusade, you have kings who go on crusades, take their armies for their kingdoms and stuff like that.
So let's kind of dive into what you just referenced there, because there is the accusation that Pope Urban II was offering salvation or selling salvation in a way to get people to join the crusade. Now, you mentioned plenary indulgence. Is that the right word?
Yeah, okay. The idea of
But my interpretation of an indulgence isn't necessarily like, I don't think the concept is wholly unbiblical, but I would agree with Martin Luther that you shouldn't be selling indulgences. I think not that the concept of an indulgence is entirely unbiblical, but the idea that, so is there a difference between this indulgence versus promising salvation, or
well,
is there a nuance that's missing in this conversation?
yes, and it's not indulgence. If you think about it, has nothing to do with salvation. It's to do with time out of purgatory. I know as a Protestant, you probably have issue with purgatory, but um, back then it was firmly believed by all Christians, and um, it's a thing. People like Pope Gregory have visions of purgatory. Those were influential in the medieval age, and then because it's a long time, a lot of people are going to be in purgatory. So the idea of an indulgence is time out of purgatory. it's not to do with salvation. Like if you go on a crusade and you commit a grave sin, you're going to hell, right? And you die without repenting of that sin, you're going to hell. Doesn't matter if there's an indulgence or not.
Okay, so that accusation kind of falls a little flat that the Urban was promising salvation to fighters.
Yeah, like it's kind of like, because unfortunately a lot of people get their knowledge of the Crusades from this abomination of a movie called Kingdom of Heaven.
Okay,
Uh,
Ridley Scott.
yeah, I'm sure you've seen it.
I actually have not seen it,
Okay.
but I'm under the impression it's not very good. And Ridley Scott isn't exactly the most historic director. I mean, Gladiator is a fun movie and all, but let's not pretend like it's historically accurate because Commodus was emperor for like 17 years or something like that.
Mhm.
So, you know, and then Napoleon's kind of been universally hated for its ahistoricism, but I've not actually seen Kingdom of Heaven, which I kind of heard was middle of the road, but
Well, it's really good in terms of like effects and stuff, but like it takes place. It's not the First Crusade. It takes place during the Crusader states, and basically they portray the king fairly well, uh, but like pretty much as soon as the king turns around, like the Templars are like trying to kill the Muslims raiding their caravans. Like, no, there was a lot of stability there. There's a few ugly episodes, but like there's a scene in Kingdom of Heaven where they're about to board the boats to sail to the Holy Land, where there's this clergyman preaching. It's like whoever kills an infidel is guaranteed paradise and stuff. And I'm like, that's not what was preached. It's so simplistic, right? Uh, I don't think these people have done any serious study of the Crusades, but I promise you that that movie has influenced a lot more people than any YouTube videos have. So
yeah, YouTube seems to be pretty pro Crusade. Like even the videos were like, wow, good. I just kind of have an admiration for the Crusaders because they stuck out. You know, I kind of view Satan through everything he could at the Crusaders, and they still prevailed and took Jerusalem and stuff like that. He threw everything he could at them, including some ugly episodes with dubious relics and stuff like that.
yeah, no, that happened when they they took Antioch. They claimed to have found a spear that had
The
pierced.
Holy Lance.
Yeah, the Holy Lance. Although that was almost certainly a fake because the Crusaders had seen the actual Holy Lance in Constantinople just a few months earlier, so they were like, "Are you sure?" But like the person who claimed to have found it, I believe it was Peter the Hermit, who was a kind of a famous clergyman on the Crusade. He was like at that point things were pretty desperate. They didn't know if they were going to make
Yeah,
it.
so just to give some background, Antioch was like a siege. It lasted around 2 years, give or take. It wasn't the most competently executed siege because I don't think they had the manpower to fully surround the city of Antioch. But because they had to defend their eastern flank, and there's a lot of valiant efforts in doing that, like very audacious charges, cavalry charges that basically saved them from saved the Crusade siege from being just overrun by a relief force. But it's a very long siege that
Yeah.
puts the Crusades to the test. Because again, they didn't have the manpower, the resources to really conduct the siege. Uh,
Yeah, and keep in mind the like now like Antioch no longer exists now, but like back then Antioch was huge. It was like New York City, like of that part of the world. It was a huge city. Uh, like you had Constantinople, that was probably the biggest city in the area, and you had Antioch as a short second. And about 20 years earlier, it had come under Turkish control. Now, the Turks had split it into two groups. Um, like the Turkish Empire had fractured and split into two groups.
there was a Fatimids, and if you want to go
No,
south, or are you talking about
th-
closer to Sultanate of Rum? And
yeah, I'm talking about the
okay,
Sultanate of Rum and the Seljuk Empire.
okay,
And they had in the Battle of Nicaea, and in the Battle of Derilium, they were fighting the Sultanate of Rum, whereas at Antioch, they're fighting the main Seljuk Empire. And so, of course, they hear rumors that I think it was Kurbaga, that was the Turkish Seljuk leader, is bringing his army. So they need to take the city quickly so they can, as soon as they take the city, it's a lot easier to defend. But if they get a pincer move, they're finished. So they eventually bribe a guy on the wall to kind of let them in, a Christian. I believe he was an Armenian. And so they basically open the gates and then they take the city. And then the Turkish army arrives. But the Turkish army was surprisingly shocked. The Crusaders just went and charged them and they fled. Turns out the army was smaller than they thought it was going to be. And at this time, like, the Turkish power has been crippled. And so the Fatimids, who you talked about a moment ago in Egypt, are able to take Jerusalem and several parts of the Holy Land back from the Turks. And so
There's a lot of changing hands with the cities after the Antioch.
Yeah, because like at that time, the Turks had loss after loss after loss. Because I don't think they were used to the fighting, the type of thing that came from the West. Like a huge armored knight on horse, the Frankish charge. They had not seen that before, and so they were kind of unequipped to fight against European knights. I mean, who wants to fight against a knight? Seriously, like, that's got to be a scary thing, right? Especially back then with all the armor and on the horse, and the horse has armor. So they did their damage to the Turks, and then they head down south to try to take Jerusalem, and they managed to. And of course, there's some people say, oh, as soon as again, Kingdom of Heaven, they're like, oh yeah, 100 years ago when the Crusaders took the city, they killed everyone inside the wall. That's not true. Yes, they did kill quite a few people, unfortunately, but the idea that they killed every single person inside the walls that's fake. It's not true at all. There was I've read a couple chronicles on it, a couple primary sources. You got Fulcher of Chartres. He talks about how a large group of the Muslims were allowed to leave. And this other guy, a clergyman on the crusade named Robert the Monk, he talks about how after they had taken the city, the Crusaders made the surviving the Muslims take out the corpses of the dead Muslims. You can't do that if all the Muslims are dead, right? So, again, that's more fiction from Kingdom of Heaven. I know you haven't seen it. I prefer if you keep it that way. It's such an abomination of a movie.
So let's kind of rewind the beginnings of the First Crusade. Alexius Komnenos, that's how you pronounce it, right, is the emperor of the Eastern Romans or Byzantine Empire. Yeah. He has a long preparation for this crusade. Like, he's been preparing for this for years. He's been trying to shore up his western flank and his other flanks and stuff like that. So the initial design of the First Crusade is supposed to be, knights from the west are trying to help the Eastern Romans recapture some of their lost territory with the end goal of reestablishing Jerusalem under a Christian nation and its rule. So that is, a correct understanding, correct? Or
yeah, well, in 1071, the Turks had defeated Romanos IV Diogenes, who was the emperor. He was campaigning out in Anatolia in the summers of 68, 69. For the summer of 70, he sent a general. He had stuff to take care of. But in 71, he's back out there again in eastern Anatolia. His army gets defeated, and pretty soon pretty much in the next few years, like all of Anatolia is overrun. It's under Turkish control now. So like all that farmland, like all the towns are now paying taxes to the Turks instead of paying taxes to Constantinople. So the revenue's drying up. And something else that's happening, the Byzantines, if you've ever studied Byzantine history, they're getting attacked by the Normans too. The Normans,
Right.
they loved stealing Byzantine land, the Normans.
And they crushed the Normans crushed them like so much.
Yeah, they're
I kind of view the Byzantines as like the Cleveland Browns of world empires. Like they're just always in a rebuilding year, and even after Justinian's restoration, like it's immediately taken away by the plague, uh, and it doesn't really last. Maybe it was Belisarius who was more to be credited with that. Uh, but they're always in a rebuilding year, and
well, the thing is, in the year 1000, the Byzantine Empire was huge. It had captured Antioch again. It had captured northern Syria. They would have probably gone all the way to get Jerusalem. So in 1025, you got Basil II, also known as the Bulgar Slayer. He dies in 1025. Then his brother Constantine the Eighth takes over for 3 years, and then you kind of have about 30 years of very bad emperors. But the empire can handle it because it's so large. But as soon as you have the Turks and the Normans, things start to go back. I think in 1081, when Alexius Comnenus becomes emperor, he had 300 soldiers left in the whole empire. Like he didn't have
wow.
a lot left. There's no way you're taking Anatolia back with 300 soldiers. And so like he tries some stuff. He takes some troops along the coast, tries to raid the coast, captures a few towns there. There's a great primary source called the Alexiad by Anna Comnena. That's the daughter of Alexius Comnenus. It's like a 500-page biography. It's published by Penguin. You can go purchase it. Amazing book. I got mine over there. It's one of my favorite books from that era. And it talks about the Crusades as well. But yeah, so he's trying to get that, and then eventually that coincides with a bunch of pilgrims from the West going to Jerusalem and getting slaughtered. I know Peter the Hermit had gone on a pilgrimage earlier in his life, and he kind of escaped by the skin of his teeth. And so that kind of coincided with the First Crusade. Alexius Comnenus appeals to Pope Urban, and then he's like, okay, let's get the idea of a crusade had been floated about by Pope Gregory VII in 1064 in his letter to Henry IV of all people. This was when they were on good terms before he excommunicated Henry IV the first time. So the idea had been thrown around, but it was Urban II who eventually called it in Clermont, and then eventually the next year the plan was to rendezvous at Constantinople, and they all did. There's like the Peasants' Crusade, which was like
People's Crusade, and then
like
mostly we focus on the Crusade of Princes, I believe it's called.
Yeah.
But
Now, in the First Crusade, there's no kings on the First Crusade. There's rich vassals like Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Toronto, who was actually the son of Robert Guiscard. He was one of the Norman leaders who was attacking the Byzantine Empire. So when he shows up
right,
in Constantinople, Alexius Comnenus was a bit nervous. He's like, ooh. But and so he makes them like swear oaths to them that, okay, if there's land that belonged to me, it comes back to me. And they were kind of uneasy about that, but they eventually decided to go along with it. And so, yeah, then they start the crusade into Anatolia.
I just want to say, like, having a military that's capable of fighting the Seljuks, who, Turks, very much a cavalry force, a light cavalry force, and then having that same military also be equipped to fight Normans. Just think, how Vikings fight, very heavy infantry style. Like, that's a challenge to have a military be able to take on both of those threats. Like, that's a hard thing to equip.
Well, I don't think the crusade was specifically against the
No,
Normans.
I'm just saying, like, the Byzantines military,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
like, just kind of, appreciate the challenge that they faced. And then, the People's Crusade ultimately comes to an end at Nicaea, correct? When,
Yeah, around there. They had
they were a little bit of a burden. And then,
yeah, well, they're kind of antsy in Constantinople. It's like, we want to get across, and then they and then they're like, okay, we'll ferry you across into the danger zone. And then they raid a couple forts, and then but that as soon as they come across a main Turkish force, they're completely wiped out. And the main body of the crusade, as soon as they come over, they're heading to Nicaea, and they see the pile of the People's Crusade, their pile of corpses there, and they kind of pay their respects to them. And it talks about that in the Chronicle of Fulcher of Chart. Like, as soon as they're going to Nicaea, and they see them, and then when the Turks fight the Crusaders at Nicaea, like, I think they kind of underestimated them. I think they were going to be more farmers with pitchforks, and they get a bunch of armored knights who they hadn't seen before, and they got completely owned. And then Nicaea, famous for the Council of Nicaea, of course, goes back to the Byzantine Empire. So, and stays with them until, I believe, 1333.
quite some time.
Yeah, so about 230 years. It's interesting because if you ever want to talk about the Fourth Crusade and if it led to the fall of the Byzantine Empire, like, I got some primary sources on that as well, if you wanted.
Okay, I'm sure we'll get to that. Let's kind of wrap up the First Crusade first. So obviously they're going through Anatolia. The Byzantines, I think, take more of a northern route to kind of mop up and
Yeah, like,
reclaim.
they kind of come down the coast and just kind of take back all the
Right.
land that the Turks had taken, and there's no Turks to oppose them because the Crusaders have taken them out.
Yeah. So the Crusade, moves east. I believe one guy goes to Edessa, and establishes the First Crusader state, and then they go to Antioch, and the Byzantines get news that things have lost, so they kind of don't help them out. So
Yeah.
what do the primary sources say about that?
Okay. So things were like, as you pointed out, the taking of Antioch was a super long siege. It took a long time. It took over a year, closer to 2. So it's a long siege, and at one point it starts to look very hopeless. And the people start deserting the crusade. Then a guy named Stephen of Blois, and the whole time they're like, well, eventually the Byzantines will get down here and help us out, and they'll take the city. So a knight named Stephen of Blois goes back to Constantinople, and on the way back, he runs into Alexius Comnenus, who's doing the mop-up operations, and it's hopeless. They're trying to get Antioch. It's not going to work. They're probably destroyed already, so it's pointless. And then so he's like, oh, thanks for telling me. So then he goes back to Constantinople. And so the Crusaders they eventually hear this, and they're furious. And so they break their oath to the Byzantine Empire. It's like, all right, we're not going to give any more land back if we capture it. So that's why they took Antioch for themselves. And then you had Bohemond, who established the Principality of Antioch.
And he did that because he took the citadel of the city, right?
Well, there was,
I know
yeah,
that was a fight in Antioch of who got the citadel.
yeah, that played a role. In fact, if you take a look at read this chronicle, it increases the numbers by about tenfold. They said there were 60,000 people in the citadel. That's pretty much impossible. It was probably closer to 6,000. So he's the hero of Antioch. Bohemian takes the citadel, and then because of that, he essentially gets the city, and he's like, "I'm done. I've got my thing." He's got his piece of the Eastern Roman Empire since he's a Norman. He's like, "I'm happy with this," and he does not go to Jerusalem. He's finished with the crusade, and then eventually, this like 8 years later, but he actually goes to war with the Byzantine Empire and
Yeah, and he loses.
and he becomes the vassal. In fact, if you read the the Alexiad by Anna Komnena that I told you about a few minutes ago, uh, she reproduces the text of of the vassal contract he has to sign, and it is ugly. Oh man, it's humiliating.
Yeah, I think I recall, because that guy had a pretty sad life after the Crusades. Like he was kind of like this hero, and then he, I guess ego or trying to. I think it had to do with him trying to take over another territory in via secession or play a role in that or something like that. And it just went
Yeah,
downhill for him.
yeah, and then he had to become
So
the vassal. Yeah.
after Antioch, then you have like the relic thing that we kind of already talked about to go to Jerusalem. They have another siege situation there, but it seems to, they learned their lesson. And I believe the most interesting aspect is that they were, they learned how to combat Greek fire on, the wall defense. They learned how to do that. So, they were defended or it allowed them to take the wall of Jerusalem.
Well, a thing that because like the whole time during the Crusades, they're sending letters back to and from the Pope and to and from other people in Europe. They had sent it to some Venetians, so Venetians sent some supplies to the coast of Jerusalem, because keep in mind, Jerusalem is not on the coast; it's inland. So they get the supplies and they use that supplies to make siege towers. And so it's take, and keep in mind, Jerusalem is a lot smaller than Antioch is. Like, it's important, obviously, it's an important city for Jews, Christians, and the Muslims, but it's not big like Antioch.
And doesn't it also have a mountain to give it cover?
Yeah, but they were
High
able
ground.
to make siege towers, so they were able to breach the walls quite easily. They didn't have that in Antioch, and so because of that, they're able to take the city. And on I believe it's July 15th, 1099. That's the day they took Jerusalem and established a kingdom of uh, Jerusalem. And then there's this debate who is going to be the king, and they said that no one should be called king because Christ is the king of Jerusalem, and then eventually they came up with kings, so they were going to give it to Raymond of Toulouse, but he said no, so they ended up giving it to someone else.
Wasn't it Godfrey
Godfrey Bouillon. Yeah.
Bouillon? Yeah. So around this time, I don't know if it was before in Antioch. There's a lot of shuffling of the deck because of all the feudal ties and stuff like that. So you had a bunch of people that had no ties to, their lord, was either dead or, kind of went crazy or whatever. So, who are we going to follow and be loyal to was kind of an issue, right?
Um,
Uh, so they had to like shuffle, each person had to like choose their lord, I guess, if they had zero, hierarchy there.
well, I know that Antioch was taken by like Bohemian. He was and there was a big question: are they like a vassal of the Byzantine, or like kind of a extension of the Byzantines, or are they a Crusader state? And the truth is, they exist till 1268. That they kind of do both. They're kind of a player in the region. They're kind of like almost a city state with
But
its
But I
vassal.
guess my question is about how Antioch had a lot of casualties. Isn't that the city where they were? That's not the city where they, there's cannibalism or anything like that. I think that was somewhere else, right? But
You're thinking of Alexandria on the Fifth Crusade, yeah.
no, somewhere on the First Crusade.
Okay, I know there was cannibalism in Alexandria on the Fifth Crusade
Okay,
because they
but
had
you're not
starved
as
out the city.
convinced on the First Crusade.
I don't know. I don't know offhand. I know by the time they had taken Antioch, they were like fresh out of supplies, but like they had supplies in Antioch, and then they're like, oh no, we've got this fresh army coming up, and then they kind of sneak attack the army, kind of preempt them, because I think the army thought they would have to fight a siege, but they attacked them on land, and they were not expecting that, so they routed Kerbaga's forces there.
All right, so the First Crusade, someone ends at Ascalon, and there's like a more or less kind of a defeat at, I want to say, Joppa or some other city, some coastal city. It just didn't work out with them trying to take that. Uh, but ultimately, uh, what happened with Jerusalem as far as like the city goes? People talk about how many Christians or how many people were killed. Do we have any like stats on the figures
We
or?
we do actually. Now again, it's this chronicle here, Chronicle of Fulcher of Chart. He gives the number 10,000. Now that number is problematic because all of his figures
It's
are
round.
about 10 times higher than they should be. He said
Okay.
that the army that sieged Nicaea was 600,000. I promise you that's impossible. He said the Turkish army at the Battle of Aurelium was 380,000. I gave you the example of the citadel in Antioch, 60,000, probably about 10 times too high. And so I've done some Googling. It says in the temple, that was where it all culminated. There was a slaughter of 10,000 people there. However, the prayer capacity, so keep in mind, he exaggerates by about tenfold. And the prayer capacity of that building, it's the same building today. I looked it up online. It says about 1,500. And the Crusaders would have to be in there too, in addition to the Muslims. So it's probably like 1,000 there and probably like 1,000 throughout the city. Keep in mind, it's not a huge city. Because like if you go to Jerusalem today, there's like the old city, like the four quarters, the Jewish quarter, Muslim quarter. That's pretty much the size of the city. Like now you got the Ottoman walls, but that was not even there. Um, I believe like I've got a couple other primary sources. They don't give a. I know the Jewish community was hurtled into the synagogue. They locked it up and set it on fire. Kind of an ugly episode there. But I think the only one that gives a figure of some sort is Fulcher of Chart. Robert the Monk doesn't give one. I don't think I'm pretty sure that Albert of Aiken doesn't have one. Raymond of Aguilera doesn't have one. Ibn al-Kalanisi, that's an Islamic source, he doesn't have one. So like when people give a total, they normally say 10. Again, I've explained why that's problematic. It's probably much less, but yeah. So yeah, and we don't have the raw figures. Essentially, we got to make estimates.
All right. And a lot of history is filled with embellished numbers. Going back to Herodotus,
Yep.
who's kind of legendary for it, but
Yeah, I think
at
he
the same
started.
time, I don't. I don't think he was doing 10x on what was plausible. So moving on, things don't exactly go well in the Second Crusade or the little crusade in between that. But let's kind of fast forward to the Fourth Crusade, which is kind of the more controversial. Actually, before that, what initiated the Third Crusade,
Okay, well, the Third
or
Crusade.
what initiates even the Second and the Third Crusade?
Okay, well, the Second Crusade's easy. That's the, like you talked about, the county of Edessa, the First Crusader state. That falls to a Islamic leader named Zengi, and he slaughters the people in there. So the Second Crusade is meant to go and get that land back. You had two kings, King Louis VII of France, and then there was the Holy Roman Emperor. I think it was Conrad. I apologize, I can't remember. But anyway, the Holy Roman Emperor. They essentially go into Anatolia again, and they don't have the same luck they had on the First Crusade. There's some French and the Germans in the Holy Roman Empire are forced back to Constantinople. Some French take a boat down to there, and basically King
So they don't travel together.
no, they go separate, and there's kind of some interesting battles. Like there's this one where King Louis the VII is in Anatolia. There's a river. The Turks are on the other side of a river. They're like following, just waiting for a spot where they can cross, and then they find a place where the water's shallow, and then they smash the Turks. It's kind of entertaining, that battle. And then eventually they get down to the Holy Land. They make some bad choices. They attack Damascus, who is an ally of theirs, because they're like, eventually Zengi is going to capture that.
So they're trying to preemptively capture because,
Yeah,
what makes a man turn neutral, I guess.
yeah. Unfortunately, they didn't get it, but then Zengi captured it, and so they got it anyway. And then what's interesting about the Second Crusade is the French king, King Louis VII, brought his wife on the crusade, and his wife was none other than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Have you heard of her?
Name rings a bell.
Okay, so and then they get in a huge fight on the crusade, and then so as soon as they get back to Europe, she seeks a divorce or an annulment, and she gets married to King Henry II of England. And they produce a son. Well, they produce a few sons. Richard the Lionheart, and that's where the Third Crusade comes in. So the Second Crusade failed to restore the county of Edessa, but the Crusaders still had Jerusalem. They still had two other Crusader states: County of Tripoli, Principality of Antioch. So it's
that Crusader states what initiates the Second Crusade.
Yeah.
And is that called for by the Pope, or was that more or less?
The Pope called them. Yeah.
Okay. And then the Third Crusade is called by the Pope for what reason?
Well, in 1187, and this is covered in Kingdom of Heaven, if you the Sultan Saladin, who is kind of overrated. He was not a good commander in army. He was good at diplomacy, but the Crusaders had beat Saladin several times, but then their king died and got replaced by a king who's a very bad commander. He attacks Saladin, his army gets completely slaughtered, so they lose their army, and he attacks Jerusalem and takes Jerusalem. So Jerusalem has fallen to the Muslims. Eventually the news gets back to the Pope, and a crusade is called the Third Crusade, where it's the Super Bowl of Crusade. You had Saladin on one side, Richard the Lionheart, King Louis II of France, Frederick I, also known as Frederick Barbarossa, and King William of Sicily, but he essentially dies as soon as he gets there. But those three. Now, King Richard and King Louis II go by boat. King Frederick goes by land, and he drowns in a river, crossing a river, and a few of his army eventually do make it down to Acre, because Acre's is the new capital after
Yeah, without Jerusalem.
Yeah, and Saladin is sieging Acre. Well, he took Acre. Now the Crusaders are trying to siege it back. And so
By
there's
sea?
what? Sorry.
By land or by sea?
At that point, it was only by land. Then
Okay.
eventually Richard arrives. He does a sea blockade as well. And at that point, they can no longer reinforce the city. Saladin does try to supply it by water, but Richard sunk his ships. And then they do manage to take the city. Now, a thing that James White talked about is he slaughtered 2,700 men, because the 2,700 soldiers who were defending Acre um, were taken. And basically, Richard told Saladin, okay, I demand 200,000 of, I can't remember the currency they used, but 200,000 of that currency, and I'll free your men. And
So he
basically,
was ransoming.
yeah, ransoming. And basically, they kept stalling. So basically, Saladin's like, oh, I need more time. I need more time. And Richard put it off for a while, but eventually he'd had enough. He's like, nope, you've had enough time. And he has all of them executed in plain sight.
Yeah, I don't
And
really see how that's. Yeah, I don't see how that's definitionally murder. I mean, they're prisoners of war, but at the same time, you're trying to ransom them. They're essentially hostages.
yeah,
You know.
and like the thing James White does, like he'll talk about an ugly episode in the Crusades, but it's true that all war has ugly episodes. Like I'm
Right.
sure there's some wars he supports, and you can go into those wars and find ugly episodes where the good guys, the side that you're cheering for, although they're fighting the good fight, they do some stuff that's immoral. They kill civilians. They'll do things they shouldn't do. That happens in all war. I'm not saying it's good, but like I'm just saying if you apply that standard, you better be a categorical pacifist, and I don't think James White is that.
Well, you're not allowed to fight wars that benefit Christians abroad. Yeah, maybe that's kind
Seems
of
that
the
way.
trend line.
It seems that way. He's got this this kind of. In fact, I wrote on X today. I'm like, question: was it wrong for the Spanish to engage in the Reconquista? Because that was technically that was in Europe, but I mean, yeah, I'm sure some ugly things happened in those wars, But I don't know. That guy, he's starting.
So, but he seems to want to draw a delineation between uh the Battle of Tours and the Siege of Antioch by means of the Crusades were not fighting for a nation or anything like that, whereas Charlemagne was fighting for a nation and therefore it was legitimate, which I just think is inaccurate because first of all they went in there fighting with the Byzantines, so they were an auxiliary force to
Yeah,
very special auxiliary force, but that's how it started. So, by James White's own criterion, the Crusaders were actually a legitimate force. Now, when things go south, they're still there and they complete the mission. And then they set up Crusader states, which actually gives them more legitimacy by White's criteria of fighting for a standing or an established nation.
yeah. So like, I mean, it's true technically that the First Crusade was kind of a group of Yeah, and keep in mind at that time,
There's
you
free
don't have like
companies
a
and
nation
stuff
like
like that.
that's kind like you don't really have nations in Europe. Like at that time, the Count of Toulouse, Count Raymond of Toulouse, was more powerful than the King of France. Like that's how things were
Right.
back then. Like if you go 200 years after that, yeah, the king is the most powerful man, but not at the time. Like it was a very different place in 1095 than it is in 2024.
Right.
Yeah.
Uh, So, how does this Third Crusade end? This kind of confuses because it ends on diplomatic terms,
Yeah.
but it's not as decisive as, say, the other Crusades.
Okay, now the Third Crusade, I talk about how they capture Acre, and then they capture some coastal settlements all the way down to Jaffa. Richard defeats Saladin a few times. He doesn't attack Jerusalem. There was some debate why he didn't attack Jerusalem. Um, it like historians debate that, but like they say he was powerful because he had a big navy. So on the coast he's strong, but if he goes inland, he no longer has his navy, so he can be outflanked. Because in the Third Crusade, the Crusader army was smaller. Um, uh, than the Islamic army, but their soldiers were better, so that compensated it. So if he's inland, he can get outmaneuvered by the larger army. Anyway, there's a lot of theories. Point is, he doesn't attack Jerusalem, but he restores a lot of coastal land, and they end with the Treaty of Jaffa, signed in, I believe, September of 1192, and it's a 3-year truce. And 6 months after the truce, Saladin he dies, and his empire kind of falls apart. There's factional struggles, and like his kids, and his brother tries to steal it from his kids. It's kind of there's kind of a thing where he takes a knife, he dips his knife in poison, and he cuts off a piece of apple with he's like, oh, have some apple, trying to poison Saladin's kids, poor guy. But the point is, yes, it ends in a truce, and then you don't have any crusades after that for a while.
And then we have 1204. What was the initial inspiration for that? Because I know the goal was to take Egypt,
yeah,
because
so
they thought that Egypt, with the basically supplies and logistics, you take out Egypt, not only is Egypt rich, or if properly administered, it's rich. It's also necessarily for taking the Holy Land.
yeah, Richard the Lionheart on the Third Crusade had floated that idea around, but it didn't come to fruition. But it seemed like a popular idea. And the whole reason Richard had to stop his crusade was because the King of France had already gone back stealing his land in France, so he had to go. And so he left it unfinished. But Pope Innocent III calls the Third Crusade in 1198. I believe it was the 15th of August, on the Feast of the Assumption, which we just passed. And so Richard the Lionheart was actually supposed to lead the Fourth Crusade. He was still alive at the time, but a few months later, he's killed in a siege. He got hit by an arrow, and his surgeon probably could have saved him, but he screwed up, and it became gangrene, and that was the end of Richard. And so, like, the question is, who is going to lead the crusade? And it starts to crystallize around a group of French knights at a tournament in Champagne. They the papal preachers in town preaching the crusade, and they're like, this sounds good, except in Champagne. And for all those who want, if you go to 1peter5.com, I've written a 5,000 page a 5,000 page article on the Fourth Crusade. I put in the private chat. Perhaps you can share it. Yeah, I use primary sources. There's a couple scholars quoted in there, but that's the editor put that in. I don't like quoting modern scholars. Okay, but get back. So, like, and these French knights are from Champagne. That's not on the coast. So these people, sorry, not 5,000 page, 5,000 words. Sorry,
I mean, it might have been believable either way, but there's a lot that could be said about 1204. So
yeah, I've read all.
So they meet in Italy. I forget whether it was immediately Venice or whether they met in like Milan or Florence first and then moved to Venice.
They tried going to Genoa and Pisa,
Okay,
according to one chronicle, and tried to contract the fleet there. And they're like, you're asking for too much. We can't do that. But then they go to Venice and they tell them how much they need. And they're like, yeah, we can take care of that. And so at that time, the crusade is still being preached in Europe. So they'll be like, oh, so their plan is to get 33,000. They're kind of making an estimate that 33,000 people will show up, and uh, and 4,500 horses. That's how much they told the Venetians they needed. They gave them the price. They're like, okay, we'll kind of set it so when each crusader comes, we're expecting 33,000. It's about 100,000. So each one will pay $3 of the current. I don't know what currency they had, but it's of the currency they used. But unfortunately, only a third of the Crusaders, a third of the people they think are gonna show up, and so they have to pay extra, and they can only
You
come
have to
up.
pay the full freight.
Yeah, and they can only come up with about half the cash, and so they're like, so the Doge of Venice, that's the guy in charge of Venice, is
Yeah,
the Doge.
like the digital, like the cryptocurrency.
Yeah, yeah. So he says, okay, until you can pay the rest, you got to go attack the city of Zara, which is the modern day city of Zadar in Croatia. Back then, it was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. So they didn't really have a choice. So they're like, okay, let's go. So they take the fleet, sack Zara. And not only was Zara a Christian city, the king of Hungary was under a crusader vow. So not only have they attacked Christians, they attacked fellow crusaders. And so the Pope excommunicates the entire crusade. He's furious.
Right.
The
It was
French,
basically unsanctioned from that
yeah,
point.
oh yeah. Well, the French send an envoy to the Pope saying, "Look,
I mean, I know it changes, but you know, the Pope didn't condone their actions.
yeah, the Pope
Well,
was not happy. The Pope was not happy. The French send an envoy to patch things up with the Pope, so they got their excommunication removed. But the Venetians did not, so they stayed excommunicated. However, at that point, a new player comes into the game, Alexius Angelus, whose
right.
dad,
He's a claimant to the emperor in Constantinople.
yeah, his dad had been Isaac the Second, who was actually the Byzantine emperor during the Third Crusade. But then his brother named Alexius, so the evil uncle, also named Alexius. There's too many Alexiuses in this story, so bear with me here. You have the young Alexius, who's with the Crusaders, and then the his uncle, who has overthrown his father and thrown him in prison, and he's fled the empire, so he's in Western Europe trying to find an army. So he comes across the Crusaders. He's like, "You guys are out of cash? Okay, I'll pay you 200,000 pieces of silver, which is more than enough to cover all your debts and then some. I'll join the crusade myself. I'll reunite the churches. I'll make the patriarch submit to the Pope." He basically gives a whole bunch of promise. I think the Crusaders only had the cash in mind, but either way. So the Crusaders are kind of like, well, I guess we don't have a choice. Then they tell the Pope. The Pope's kind of like, okay, we'll see where this goes, you know. And so then they send forth to Constantinople, and then they come across the bad Alexius the Third, is like, okay, uh, the, and then he tries to smooth things over. He's like, "Oh, we'll give you some supplies on your way to the Holy Land. You know, just kind of get out of here." You know, he tries to be polite and diplomatic, but the Crusaders aren't having it. The French knights get out front of the land walls in Constantinople. The Venetian ships go into the Golden Horn, which is the body
Right.
of water that separates Constantinople from
The river.
Galata. Yeah.
Uh,
and so then they start to siege the city, and the Venetians manage to mount the wall and set 25, I think it was 25 or 27 towers on fire. And at this point, the people in the city start to panic, including the Emperor Alexius. He decides to flee the city at night.
But not before he takes everything.
Yeah, he takes as much cash as he can. And remember that the cash was one of the promises to the Crusaders. So at that point, they drag the old frail Isaac II out of the dungeon. He opens up the gates. The Crusaders and Alexius come in, and Alexius IV is crowned co-emperor with his father. And then in February and his father agrees to pay it. They told him about the agreement. He's like, this is a huge amount of money, but you've done us a huge service, so we're gonna pay you. So
yeah, it's not like he has much of a choice.
Yeah, they didn't have much of a choice. But,
now, did they blind Isaac II?
Well,
I know they had a history of blinding people to.
His brother, well, he was already blind at this point because his brother had blinded him when he threw him in the dungeon. And his son Alexius had fled, so he didn't get blinded. But
I'm not sure if that's like an Eastern Orthodox thing that you can't rule if you're blind, or
yeah, it was kind of like a Roman thing, and so basically, and he dies not long after this. He dies, I believe, in February of 1204 of old age. So now Alexius IV is ruling on his own, and he pays half the money to the Crusaders. They're waiting for more, but eventually, and so then eventually the people in Constantinople are just furious. They're like, you've brought this foreign army there, you've paid them a bunch of our money, they're not happy. So at that point, there's a guy in the city of Constantinople named Mortzophilus. Now, Mortzophilus was his nickname. His real name was Alexius. I know, a lot of Alexiuses. So he kills Alexius IV, and he's crowned Alexius V. And he hates the Crusaders. He's like, I'm not paying them another penny. And so the Crusaders, and so he sends out an army to attack the Crusaders on land, but
that doesn't work.
He repelled. Yeah, like they got nothing on the French knights. And then,
bold strategy.
Yeah, and so then on the 12th of April, 1204, they siege the walls of the city from the Golden Horn, and then they go and open the door. The French knights come in, and believe it or not, there's not a lot of people killed, but the city was looted to the nines. Like all the relics were taken to, all the gold in the churches was taken because they had to pay themselves now. So they looted everything. And it's funny because now you go out west. If you've ever been to Venice, remember half these are Venetian, these Crusaders. If you go to Saint Mark's Square, you see the cathedral there. They got these bronze horses. Those were from Constantinople.
Right.
If you go to the Vatican, you can see the relics of Saint John Chrysostom. Well, how come the relics of Saint John Chrysostom are at the Vatican, right? Again, Fourth Crusade, that you got relics of all these Greek saints in Western Europe now. And that's how the Shroud of Turin got taken to Western Europe. And yeah, so they essentially rule Constantinople until 1261, and until it's taken back by Michael VIII, and he's an interesting character.
So I kind of view this, Fourth Crusade. There's treachery basically on all sides, and Alexios. The fourth, I didn't really view as a good guy, but you're also saying Alexios the fifth was probably even worse. And the evil uncle Alexios was, let me just cash out. Whatever happened to him.
Well, the thing is, there's Alexios the third, and then Alexios the fifth, who was the one who attacked the Crusaders, and who was the leader when the Crusaders attacked. He flees. So you have two claimants to the emperor kind of out there wandering around. They eventually join forces together, Alexius III and Alexius V. And they're like, let's band together, put our forces together to try to take back Constantinople from the French. And then he's like, okay, then Alexius III backstabs Alexius V, has him blinded. So then he's walking around the countryside blind. He's picked up by a patrol of crusaders, and he's taken back to Constantinople. They take him to the top of the pillar and throw him off and kill him. So that's the end of Alexius V. And Alexius III, he stays out there, but I think he dies in like 1215, around there.
So your thoughts, I've never really viewed the Byzantines from being able to recover from 1204. Certainly when the Ottomans kind of came up, there was just no victories to be found. Like they couldn't negotiate their way out of. They couldn't even, Ottomans would not honor peace treaties or marriage alliances or anything like that. So they don't really recover from this. It just kind of all goes downhill.
Well, the Ottomans were formed in the late 1200s. That's after they had Constantinople back. At this time, there's a whole bunch of Turkish states in Anatolia.
Right.
But a third of Anatolia at this time, in 1300, if you go to 1300, they still have a large footing in Anatolia, the Byzantines. And then eventually, once the Ottomans start to expand and absorb a whole bunch of more of the smaller Turkish states, they got stronger and stronger. And then eventually, they're able to attack. They start taking away the land in Anatolia. And I think in 1337 is when they captured the last of the Byzantine land in Anatolia. So I think it was independent of the Fourth Crusade. In fact, I got a quote in that 5,000 word article I wrote. I got a quote by a 15th century Greek historian named Critobulus. It says all of the inhabitants were unarmed and unmolested. Then, having overthrown the tyranny and recovered itself, the city regained its former state and was a seat of the empire again, ruling over many races in Asia and Europe, and not a few islands. It became splendid and rich and glorious and famed, a ruler and an example in all good things, the center of learning and culture and wisdom and virtue, in fact, of all the best things in one. So it sounds like after they got it back, things became pretty good again. So I personally think the two events are independent. One didn't affect the other based on my reading of the sources.
Okay. That's a pretty interesting perspective. That I hadn't really considered because, again, I just kind of view it, from, there's ups and downs, but the trend line has been down for centuries at this point.
Yeah.
And
It had been down overall, but in that down, there's ups and downs, if that makes sense.
right. Yeah. Like a stock market portfolio that's just going down rather than up over time.
Yeah.
It's kind of how it was. So that, those are the four major crusades. I kind of wanted to flip over and talk about the Northern Europe crusades because I know that they tried to argue in order to recruit knights that, hey, these are just as valid as the Holy Land crusades. How much do you know about these crusades?
Well, I don't have a lot of primary source knowledge on these crusades because it's really hard to find primary sources on this stuff, but I got some secondary stuff. Like those crusades were usually because the church would send priests up there to do missionary work,
Yeah.
but then they would get killed, and so then this news would reach the church, and then they'd call them to do that. So it was essentially to protect the priests who were getting killed up there. Now, again, I don't know a lot about those crusades because they're really hard to find information on. Like I'm really trying to find it, but I think Albert of Aachen might have a bit on it, but like it's not the main point. He talks about the Crusades in the Holy Land. Another thing about the Crusades, it's although the Crusader states fall in the 1290s, you still have crusades that are called against the Turks, Crusade of Varna, Crusade of Nicopolis, because they were still trying to like encroach on the last area of the Byzantine Empire. Because keep in mind, in 1337, they had lost all of Anatolia, but they still have Constantinople and part of Europe. And then the Turks get across, start taking land in Thrace, the Peloponnese, like basically modern day Greece. So in 1396, they send the Crusade of Nicopolis, that fails. 1444, Crusade of Varna, that fails. 1453, on the 29th of May, is that sad Tuesday when they Constantinople falls to the Turks, extinguishing the last remnant of the Christians in the East, of Christian control in the East. There's still Christians in the East, but they're under Islamic domination.
So right before that, you have the Council of Florence, where I guess the East and the West kind of try to get together. And I guess there is talk of there being a crusade during that time. Ooh, that's a question. What?
Yeah. So oh, sorry.
That didn't get anywhere. So what ended up happening? Because the Council of Florence is like 1440s or maybe late 30s.
Yeah, it's about 1440, and then they basically pronounce a union. You still had John VIII Paleologos as the emperor, and he's at the council, and he basically tells his bishops to sign, and all but one sign. So they proclaim the union.
Which one was the holdout? Was it the Russians?
No, they signed. It was Mark of Ephesus who was the holdout.
Okay.
There were two holdouts. Cardinal Metropolitan Bessarion was an opponent of the Union, but he switched sides. And he stayed Catholic until the day he died, too, actually. But Mark of Ephesus stayed against the Union until the day he died. And he kind of like... pretty much the only place it has any traction is Constantinople. That's because the emperor's enforcing it. And it's like, hey, we're part of the Catholics now. Crusade, please, let's go, against the Turks, and they had the Crusade of Varna, and that failed. And
that was in like Hungary.
I believe
modern Hungary-ish.
I believe it's in modern day Bulgaria.
Okay, but this is the one where the Frankish knights kind of blundered and got a little too ahead of themselves or something like that. Burgundian knights, I should probably say. I'm pretty sure.
Well, I believe this crusade was mainly Poles and Wallachians. Wallachian is Romanian.
Yeah, Romanian.
Yeah, and they get annihilated at Varna, sold off as slaves. Ton of them are executed. Very ugly. And then basically Constantine the 11th, that's the brother of John the 8th, takes over in 1448 when he dies, and he appeals to Rome. He becomes Catholic. He's like, okay, I'm implementing the union. And it took forever for troops to get there. They finally sent some in September of 1452. They know that the Ottomans are preparing an attack. And so they're a Pope. It's like, we can't wait any longer. We need troops. Now, it's not really the Pope's fault, because in 1453, the huge event that happened in 1453, apart from the fall of Constantinople, is the end of the 100 Years' War. So the French and English are busy fighting each other. Yeah. The Spanish are in the last stage of the Reconquista. They can't help. Pretty much everyone in Europe was busy doing something else.
I mean, the Italian wars are on the horizon, right?
Yeah, no, like, they're completely fracturing. Yeah, that's true. They're fracturing in southern and central Italy. Eventually, they send about 300 archers, and they're like, that's all you get. And then they're like, okay, well, that's better than nothing. Then they proclaim the Union in Hagia Sophia in December of 1452. And then they try to defend the city. They're it's a very long siege, but ultimately it became a Turkish city on May 29th.
All right. We have a question about the Crusades against the Hussites.
Them. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've always wanted to know more about that. You got probably one of the greatest of the Czech military minds in that crusade, or leading the Hussites.
Yeah, Jan
I think he,
Žižek.
yeah, and he was a Cyclops, so I guess
Yeah,
that's pretty fun.
he eventually got blinded in his second eye too. Like for a while he was a Cyclops, but then he
And
got
he
blind.
was pretty good, being a blind commander. I
Yeah,
think,
like
if I
he'd have
recall.
it's like they're attacking our left flank. He's like, all right, send this to reinforce. Yeah, no, he was quite the leader. Now, the thing about the Hussites, I've got a ton of primary sources on them, but I've not read a lot. I'll tell you the things I know. There's some good secondary sources on them. There's a historian who writes about them named Thomas Fudge. He's collated a lot of the primary sources too. I got them over there. I can see them. And pretty much what happened is, yes, they crusade against the Hussites, and then they defeat them. John Hus and Jerome are executed. But then the thing that's interesting is what happens next. That is when everyone cuts it off, the whole thing with the Hussites. But the thing about the Hussites that don't know is what happened next. They fractured into a million different groups, and then the church helped one group, kind of like a group that was powerful and wasn't too offensive to Catholic doctrine, and then they eventually collate them all into one, and then they kind of like agree to a treaty, and then 30 years later they break the treaty. Again, I'm not too well read on that. I do have to get to that though.
So I thought John Huss died before much of the crusading against them happened, and then that's where you have
yeah, he was burnt at the Council of Constance, or shortly after the Council of Constance, by the local king of Hungary. I'm not trying to say church was involved. The church fully endorsed his burning. Um, um, and then they had to launch the Crusades, and then they eventually capture it, and then they have Jerome executed. He lasted a bit longer. Of course, he tries to recant. He kind of has a moment where he's like Thomas Cranmer. He's kind of tries to denounce the faith to save his life, and then he realizes they're going to kill him anyway. So then he goes back. Yeah, so that was probably some of the later Crusades. You've got the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. That was a crusade. I believe the Polish winged hussars at Vienna in 1689 was sanctified as a crusade, and I believe that was the last crusade ever called.
by the Pope.
Yeah, unless you want to include Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade. So
now, interesting, if we kind of fast forward through European history, there are a lot of additional wars that have religious overtones. Russo-Turkish wars seem to definitely have, from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, they might be crusades in the East, because ultimately they wanted Russian Orthodoxy to be helmed at Constantinople they wanted Constantinople for the prestige.
Yeah,
they didn't quite get that. And some have called the Crimean War the Last Crusade, which is kind of an interesting take.
Well, I don't think. Well, I think for the crusade, you have to have like the Pope sanctified as a crusade.
Right.
You have two episodes in Byzantine history where it's kind of like a holy war. The emperor declares a holy war. Basically, Emperor Heraclius did that in the 7th century against the Persians. The second one was Emperor Manuel Comnenus, who was the grandson of Alexius Comnenus, who appealed to the Pope for the First Crusade. He tries to launch a holy war in 1176, kind of like a crusade. The battle and it ended in the Battle of Cephalon in 1176, where he was essentially trying to drive the Turks out of Anatolia, and he failed. So you kind of have some equivalents over there because their church worked a bit differently. Like back then, until 1453, the emperor functioned kind of like the Pope did in the West. It's not a perfect analogy, but there's a lot of similarity. They're like the monarch over the church. Of Eastern Orthodox are not going to agree with that, but I've got sources.
I mean, one of my criticisms of Eastern Orthodoxy is I don't think it's very compatible for effective state government. That because they didn't really have secession. You can't just rebel against the rightful ruler for no reason, which seemed very common in Eastern that in the East compared to in the West. There was a lot more security with secession, even if there's disputes, in my opinion.
Well,
and
the thing that kind of screwed the pooch with the Eastern Orthodox Church is they didn't have an investiture controversy, which completely separated church and state in the 11th century in Western Europe. In fact, Pope Urban II, who called the First Crusade, he was part of the investiture controversy. Like at that time, things were going well but under Gregory VII, he had to turn things around. But that didn't happen in the East, in the Byzantine Empire. So you have things like in like the guy who takes back Constantinople from the Crusaders, Emperor Michael VIII. He got excommunicated by the Patriarch. This is unprecedented. This is the only time, as far as I know, this has ever happened. But the Patriarch saw him, he blinded a kid so he couldn't succeed him. And he's like, I'm excommunicating you. And so what happens is Patriarch Arsenius, who excommunicates him, is replaced by a guy named Joseph. And he's like, all right, Joseph, I want you to undo my excommunication. He's like, all right, boom, done. You're back in the church. And then that split the patriarchal line into a bit of a schism, because there was the Josephites and Arsenites, because they're like, how can an excommunicated emperor appoint a patriarch? So that means Arsenius is still the true patriarch. And so it had two patriarchal lines for a while. And then eventually, Michael VIII wanted to implement the Union of Lions. This is the first union. And he's like, all right, Joseph, I got my union in France. I want you to implement the union. He's like, I don't do that. I don't believe in the unions. He's like, all right, Joseph's gone. And so they put John Beckos in, and now you have three streams: the Unionists, the Josephites, and Arsenites. It was game of patriarchal thrones almost. Yeah.
Now, speaking of like a game of patriarchal thrones, you recently did a video on the papists having their own Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
The Conclave.
Yeah.
And you take a side against Avignon.
Yes, I do.
So
what did you think of that, by the way? That the video I did.
I haven't gotten around to watching it, but it was on my to-do list. But I just saw that, I'm like, wow, because because as a Protestant, it's like you look at some of the claims that the Catholics say about their faith, and it's like I kind of think that events like this kind of undermine the historic, I guess, the apostolic succession argument, I guess. So I was curious that you took a stand against the Avignon papacy. So I was definitely interested in learning more about that.
Well, and keep in mind, when I say Avignon, I mean not Avignon from 1309 to 1379, because that was the Pope, for a long reason I won't get into. The Pope had moved from Rome to Avignon, so the Pope was they essentially in 1308 or 9, I can't remember the exact year, they elect a a bishop in France as pope, and he was in France when he was elected, and he's making his way down to Rome, but he's taking care of a bunch of stuff in France first, and then he does not ever get to Rome. But by then he's elected a whole bunch of new cardinals, so they're French cardinals, so they let the new French guy, and he stays in France, and then he puts more cardinals, and I know it's a huge black eye. Eventually they go back to Rome, and then they had a conclave because the Pope Greg, I believe it's Gregory the 11th.
He's the one that resigned, right?
No. Okay, that was that's the end of the schism. So like they come from Avignon, they go back to Rome. Papacy's back in Rome. Then the people in Rome are kind of rowdy. They're like, don't even try to think of leaving. We want a Roman or at least Italian pope. And so they elect an Italian pope, Archbishop of Bari. And he goes and he stays as pope. And then a lot of the French cardinals don't like his policies. They see what he's doing, and then they don't like his policies. And then so they secretly elect their own pope, and they go back to Avignon. And they claim that the first conclave was under duress because of the angry mob outside. But they only make that claim after the fact.
Once they,
according to the source,
after they're safe.
yeah. According to the source I quote, they elected their own pope not because they thought it was duress, but because they didn't like the policies he was doing. They just used the duress claim as an excuse. So that whole line that goes to Avignon from 1378 to 1414 is a fake line, and I quote the 14th century source.
All right. Where can people learn more about your stuff? I mean, I made allusions to your channel. It's linked in the description below.
It's Allan Ruhl. Just type ALLAN space RUHO, and you'll find it in no time. I do a lot of church history stuff. You could probably tell by this, I like the primary sources, and like the Crusades are a big part. In fact, I started reading the Byzantine Emperor. About the Byzantine Empire, I started reading the primary sources because of my Fourth Crusade studying, because I read a Greek account of a guy in Constantinople, and that chronicle goes from 1118, the year Alexius Comnenus dies, all the way up to 1207. So then I read a whole bunch, then I read the Alexiad and started binging those sources. So yeah, like I'm the primary source guy. And that's how I like to learn all of my history, because a lot of modern historians are so biased. They hate the church, and I think James White, to kind of tie this all up, James White, like, oh yeah, I teach church. His stuff is from secondary sources. Like I can tell just by listening to his stuff, because like I think there's a guy who cataloged like 60 or 70 of his classes.
Is one of those secondary sources Kingdom of Heaven?
No, I don't.
That's a joke, because that wouldn't be second. That wouldn't even count as secondary. But
no, that's I think he reads a lot of Schaff and like a bunch of modern stuff. Like when he debated Sungenis on transubstantiation, like pretty much all he did was quote modern Protestant historians. Oh, all these guys agree with me. It's like, well, and I know you're an evangelical. I know you don't believe in transubstantiation, but I mean,
right.
Are you going to quote, hey, the modern Protestant historians agree with me? Like, is that going to convince me? No, but so.
So I have a book. It's called Christian History Made Easy. It was like the first Christian history book that I got long time ago. But I read it now and I'm like, yeah, there's definitely some inaccuracies here. I'm much more of a fan of Constantine, as you might be able to tell, than a lot of people in Baptist circles might be. I don't think Christians had it better under Julian the Apostate. which the book claims. And like I think that's an absurd claim.
Very
Uh,
absurd.
so I don't really, and it does try to say, maybe the Montanists weren't that bad and stuff like that. So there's some things in that book that I just didn't, does not age well. And I kind of view the Anabaptists as overall the bad guys, but in the Protestant Reformation. So we got some questions from the audience. This one is kind of interesting because Raven Ibrahim has written a very popular book on the Crusades. I don't know if you've read it, and if you have any thoughts to share on it.
I've not read the book. Again, I try to stick to primary sources, but let me recommend a book. If you want an overview of the Crusades, okay, there's two books I'm going to recommend. If you want like an overview of the Crusades by a modern historian who's not some rabid anti-Crusades person, your best bet is The New Concise History of the Crusades by Thomas Madden. Thomas Madden. In fact, I've had some email correspondence with Thomas Madden. There's a history of the expedition to Jerusalem by Fulcher of Chartres. This is the First Crusade and the Crusader states up to 1124. And there's actually one more book I want to recommend. It's published by Penguin. This book is $21, like $24 in Canada. I'm in Canada, so I don't know how much that is in American money. Maybe like 18 or something.
20-ish.
Yeah, so it's called Chronicles of the Crusades. Jeanville and Joinville and Geoffroy de Villehardouin. These are a chronicle of the Fourth Crusade. That's a very, very good chronicle. Geoffroy de Villehardouin. In fact, if you read that 5,000 word essay I wrote, I quote him a few times. And Joinville is the 7th and 8th Crusade with King Louis IX, St. Louis. So yeah, that's who you want to read. And if you want more, just send me a private thing on X, and I'll tell you what to read depending on what you're interested in.
All right. Y'all asked, how did the Islamic State go from an equal threat to a laughingstock in war that we know today? I mean, if I wanted to crack at it, I don't think they didn't adapt to naval, ships advancements, going from galleys to, mast ships. They didn't adapt to technological changes, Europeans, firearms, stuff like that. So it kind
Yeah, so basically the last great Islamic empire that posed a threat to the West is the Ottoman Empire. And by about 1700, they're well past their prime. They're no longer a significant threat. Their empire is shrinking at that point.
They're kind of viewed as a carcass to,
Yeah.
devour and split.
Yeah, like
But you can't split it too much because balance of power was like the main geopolitical thought of the day. We have to maintain the balance of power.
yeah, and that actually plays a role after the First World War in the creation of the Republic of Turkey. Like that, like the Republic of Turkey is actually what ended the Ottoman Empire. Like they sometimes call it a successor state. And I'm like, not really. They kind of squash them. But yeah, so yeah, they've essentially fallen into. All right, we got any more questions?
Yeah, last one appears to be, did the Pope try to get Avignon back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815? I don't know this one.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know for sure. It makes sense. The Pope at that time would have been Pius the sixth or seventh. I think seventh. I don't know if the Pope was at the Congress of Vienna. Like my knowledge of European history starts to fall off at around like the English Civil War with Cromwell and Charles the First getting his head chopped off, Charles the Second, and then the Jacobite uprisings and all that stuff. But I'm trying to remedy this, but I'm more of a guy who studies from about 800 to 1400. That's my prime area.
All righty. Good questions. So, anyway, if you like this kind of content, do subscribe to the channel, to the podcast if you're new, and smash that like button on your way out. My new book, Winning Not Winsome, 10 Commandments of Spiritual Warfare, is out. If you liked Megan Basham's book, and or you liked Andrew Isker's book, A Boniface Option, I think this book is very much in your wheelhouse. It's very much a practical application of what to do in the times that we are in. We just need to make very small adjustments or consciously act out, what we've already been doing. And that's kind of a rundown of what the 10 Commandments are, what they do. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel or anything, but it is new content. Like, I've never done like videos on what's in the book, so I think that's all the more reason to get it, because I don't like listening to, if I watch someone and they write a book on the material that they've already done videos or whatever on, I odds of me finishing that book pretty low, but this is not that. So anyway, that's all I got for today. And we will catch you on